Tuesday, August 28, Thessalonica and Berea. When Paul and Silas were released from prison, the missionaries departed from Philippi. We read that in Acts 16, verses 35 to 40. When it was daylight, the magistrates sent their officers to the jailer with the order, "Release those men." The jailer told Paul, "The magistrates have ordered that you and Silas be released. Now you can leave. Go in peace." But Paul said to the officers, "They beat us publicly without a trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. And now, do you want to get rid of us quietly? No, let them come themselves and escort us out." The officers reported this to the magistrates, and when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, they were alarmed. They came to appease them and escorted them from the prison, requesting them to leave the city. After Paul and Silas came out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they met with the brothers and sisters and encouraged them. Then they left. From Philippi, Paul and his companions went straight to Thessalonica, the capital city of Macedonia. Question. Read Acts 17, 1 through to 9. How did the Thessalonian Jews react to Paul's successful preaching among the Gentiles? Acts 17, beginning at verse 1. When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. "This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah," he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, saying, "These men, who have caused trouble all over the world, have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. Once again, we see Paul looking for the synagogue where he could share the gospel. Many devout Greeks and not a few prominent women were persuaded by Paul's message. That these converts joined Paul and Silas, as it said in verse 4, seems to mean they formed a separate group and met apart from the synagogue, probably in Jason's house. Moved with jealousy, their opponents started a riot. Their intention was to bring Paul and Silas, Timothy is not mentioned, before the city's assembly and accuse them. As they could not find the missionaries, Jason himself and a few other new believers were dragged to the local authorities under the charge of sheltering political agitators. Question. Read Acts 17, verses 10 through to 15. What was the response of the Berean Jews in comparison to that in Thessalonica? Acts 17, beginning at verse 10. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the Scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. As a result, many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. But when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, some of them went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up. The believers immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed at Berea. Those who escorted Paul brought him to Athens and then left with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. The term eugenes, used in Acts 17 verse 11, originally meant well-born or of noble birth, but came to denote more generally a fair-minded attitude, which is likely the case here. The Jews from Berea are praised not simply because they agreed with Paul and Silas, but because of their willingness to examine the Scriptures by themselves and on a daily basis to see if what the missionaries were saying was correct. A merely emotional response to the gospel without the necessary intellectual conviction tends to be superficial and short-lived. Before long, however, persecution interrupted Paul's productive ministry in Berea, compelling him to move farther south to Athens. And so to finish today, when was the last time you diligently searched the Scriptures in order to find out whether these things, whatever they were so?